to drift with every passion till my soul is a stringed lute on which all winds can play. Is it for this that I have given away mine ancient wisdom and austere control? Methinks my life is a twice-written scroll, scrawled over on some boyish holiday with idle songs for pipe and violet which do but mar the secret of the whole. Surely there was a time I might have trod the sunlit heights, and from life's dissonance struck one clear chord to reach the ears of God. Is that time dead? Lo, with a little rod I did but touch the honey of romance, and must I lose a soul's inheritance? For a long time before that poem had appeared in print, its author's name was providing the English public with a topic for conversation very far removed from its normal subject, at once so classic and so cozy, of the weather and the royal family. There goes that bloody fool Oscar Wilde, a gentleman in the street had audibly remarked as he passed the poet by, and the poet turned to his companion and said, "It's quite extraordinary how quickly one becomes known in London." His appearance at this time was, of course, striking. We can picture the tall, amply built young man with that powerful, indolent, Babylonian sort of face he had, with its drooping crown of long, dim hair into which, at some moment of depression, possibly the iron had entered. Often he would be wearing knee breeches, a velvet coat, a floating tie of greenish brocaded satin, and in his pale, pointed hand there would be a lily, sometimes even a sunflower. Well, now he was bound to attract attention. And this, of course, made him exquisitely happy. To have passed unnoticed anywhere in the world would have seemed to him the most ostentatious form of obscurity. As he himself said in later years, "I have no wish to pose as being ordinary, great heavens." Indeed, the only ordinary thing that Oscar Wilde seems to have done in those early years was to have fled from his native Ireland as soon as he possibly could. He wanted something, of course, that his own country could never have given him. He wanted, for one thing, to be widely talked about. Now, Dublin doubtless would have talked about him too, had indeed done so already. He had seen to that. But in Dublin, then as now, talk was mainly for talk's sake. There would have been no real result of the talk at all, you know. No largesse, no rich reward, no jeweled elegance. And the dinner tables he so rightly felt himself destined to dominate would have been in Dublin at once less opulent than those in London, and far more conversationally competitive. An English lady, once gently rebuking the poet for his faith in a fortune-teller, had said, "Fortune-telling, Mr. Wilde, fortune-telling, oh, but don't you feel that sort of thing is rather tempting Providence?" And he had answered, "Dear lady, surely Providence can resist temptation by this time." Now, who in his own Ireland would ever have listened to a crack like that without trying either to cap or to capsize it? Oh, no. England was clearly the place for him. And to England he went, and having emerged encrusted with honours from Oxford, he proceeded to London, where he found time to amuse himself and the town prodigiously, and also to fall in love with the beautiful Lily Langtry, who allowed him to worship her through a whole summer and then advised him not to waste his time. Well, I don't think he was wasting his time, really, for he left some very charming poems in celebration of her great beauty, and to one of these poems he gave no title at all. He dedicated it simply to L.L., the initials, of course, of his beloved. I remember we used to meet by an ivied seat, and you warbled each pretty word with the air of a bird, and your voice had a quaver in it, just like a linnet, and shook as the blackbird's throat with its last big note, and your eyes. They were green and grey like an April day, but lit into amethyst when I stooped and kissed, and your mouth. It would never smile for a long, long while, then it rippled all over with laughter 5 minutes after. You were always afraid of a shower, just like a flower. I remember you started and ran when the rain began. I remember so well the room, and the lilac bloom that beat on the dripping pane in the warm June rain, and the color of your gown. It was amber brown, and 2 yellow satin bows from your shoulders rose, and that handkerchief of French lace which you held to your face. Had a small tear left a stain, or was it the rain? On your hand, as it waved adieu, there were veins of blue. In your voice, as it said goodbye, was a petulant cry. You have only wasted your life. Ah, that was the knife. When I rushed through the garden gate, it was all too late. Oh, well. If my heart must break, dear love, for your sake, it will break. In music, I know. Poets' hearts break so. But strange that I was not told that the brain could hold in a tiny ivory cell God's heaven and hell. Was it prophetic, that last verse? I often wonder. And yet, how happy even an unrequited passion made the poet in those days, when he himself was indeed the happy prince of his own fairy tale, and as if to prove his theory that only the shallow loves live on forever, he recovered with remarkable rapidity from the heart that Lily Langtry had broken, and he journeyed most cheerfully to America to lecture there on art and aesthetics. He was now 28 years of age, and having expressed a faint disapproval of the Atlantic Ocean, and announced on arrival at the New York Customs House that he had nothing at all to declare except his genius, he proceeded to give to his transatlantic audiences all they expected, and possibly a little more too. Now, here are some of his own impressions of the town of Leadville, the richest and roughest city in the world in the early 1880s. While I was lecturing at Denver, he writes, I received a message that if I went on to Leadville as I proposed to do, the harsher spirits there would be sure to shoot me or my traveling manager. I at once wrote and told them that nothing they could possibly do to my traveling manager would intimidate me, and I went. At my lecture last night, a baby was present, and when I said there is no more beautiful way of appreciating nature than through art, the baby burst into tears. I said I wished the juvenile enthusiast there would restrain its raptures, and all was mysteriously silent once more. My audience otherwise was mainly composed of miners, whose huge, somber hats, red shirts, and high leather boots made me think of 17th century cavaliers. There they sat, rows and rows of them, enormous, powerfully built men, silent as the grave, their eyes watchful, their brawny arms folded over their muscular chests, a gun on each thigh. I spoke to these delightful fellows about the earlier Florentine schools, and they slept as peacefully as though no crime had ever stained the ravines of their wild mountain home. I described to them the pictures of Botticelli, and the name that seemed to them, I suppose, like a new drink, aroused them from their dreams. I read them certain passages from the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, and he proved so popular that they asked me as one man why the hell I hadn't brought him with me. I explained, of course, that Benvenuto Cellini had been dead for some years, and this elicited the immediate demand, who shot him? They then invited me to supper, and their amazement when they saw that art and appetite could go hand in hand knew no bounds. When I lit a long cigar and quaffed a couple of cocktails without flinching, they cheered me until the silver fell down in glittering dust from the roof onto our table. Incidentally, Oscar Wilde drank those miners under that very table on that very night. And indeed, it seems that he had a wonderful time all over the United States, and I think it's delightful to reflect that among the many distinguished Americans who welcomed him to their country were Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, and the authoress of Little Women and Good Wives. There. Of course, what Miss Louisa May Alcott thought of Mr. Oscar Wilde, or indeed what Oscar thought of Louisa May, history, alas, has never related. When he got back to Europe, he lived for a few months in Paris, and on his return to London, he fell in love all over again, and this time he married her, a gentle and very beautiful Irish girl called Constance Mary Lloyd. They were passionately and mutually in love and extremely happy, and at the same time, Wilde was making his first experiments in the art of the dramatist. His first two plays were what today would be briefly and brutally dismissed as flops. But quite soon he had produced a resounding success called Lady Windermere's Fan, and this, of course, it was that first set the seal of definite popularity upon an already considerable artistic reputation, and that earned for him, too, the cachet of modernity. He was regarded, indeed, by his contemporaries as the symbol of ultra-modernism, and to my mind, the modern, who also happens to be a man of genius, is not contented with merely echoing the age he lives in, he invents it. Oscar Wilde, I seriously suggest to you, invented the period we speak of today as the 1890s, through the first half of which famous decade he strutted, and through the second half of which he staggered. The strutting phase, when he was dandy of dress, dandy of speech, dandy of manner, dandy of wit, dandy even of ideas and of intellect. The period, in fact, during which he invented that curious flower forever associated with his name, the green carnation, has a characteristic moment in a little scene from his comedy An Ideal Husband, a scene which opens with Lord Goring between two London parties, explaining to his manservant Phipps the subtle influence of the buttonhole upon thought. Now, Lord Goring enters in a white tie with a rather faded flower in his coat to find that Phipps, his servant, is waiting for him. And to Phipps he says, "Got my second buttonhole for me, Phipps?" "Yes, my lord." "Ah, rather distinguished thing, Phipps. I am the only person of the smallest importance in London at present who wears a buttonhole." "Yes, my lord, I have observed that." "You see, Phipps, fashion is what one wears oneself. What is unfashionable is what other people wear." "Yes, my lord." "Just as vulgarity is simply the conduct of other people." "Yes, my lord." "And falsehoods the truths of other people." "Yes, my lord." "Other people are quite dreadful, Phipps. The only possible society is oneself." "Yes, my lord." "To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance, Phipps." "Yes, my lord." I don't think I quite like this buttonhole, Phipps. Makes me look a little too old. Makes me almost in the prime of life, eh, Phipps? For the future, a more trivial buttonhole, perhaps, on Thursday evenings. "I will speak to the florist, my lord. She has had a loss in her family lately, which perhaps accounts for the lack of triviality your lordship complains of in the buttonhole. Extraordinary thing about the lower classes in England. They're always losing their relations." "Yes, my lord, they are extremely fortunate in that respect." "Want my cab round at once?" "Thank you, Phipps, that will do." "Thank you, my lord." Phipps's views on family life seem somewhat lax. Really, if one's own servants don't set one a good moral example, what on earth is the use of them? Lord Caversham, oh my God. Now, why will one's parents always appear at the wrong time? Some extraordinary mistake in nature, I suppose. "Delighted to see you, my dear father." "Take my cloak off, sir." "Oh, is it really worthwhile, father?" "Of course it is worthwhile, sir. No draughts, I hope, in this room?" No draughts, father." "Glad to hear that. I want to have a serious conversation with you, sir." "My dear father, a serious conversation at this hour? Why, it's long after 7. And my doctor says I must not have any serious conversation after 7. It makes me talk in my sleep." "Talk in your sleep, sir? Well, what does that matter? You're not married, are you?" No, father, I'm not married." That is what I have come round here to talk to you about, sir. You've got to get married, you hear me? You've got to get married, and at once. Why, damn it, sir, when I was your age, I had been an inconsolable widower for 3 months. And I was already paying my addresses to your admirable mother. Damn it, sir, it's your duty to get married. Your duty, sir. You can't always be living for pleasure, you know. High time you got a wife, sir. You are 34 years of age. I know that, father, but I only admit to 32. 31 and a half when I have a really good buttonhole. This buttonhole is not quite trivial enough. I tell you, you are 34, sir. And what is more, there is a draught in your room, sir. I feel a draught, sir. I feel a draught distinctly. So do I, father. It's a dreadful draught. Dear father, do let me take you to another room. Your sneezes are positively heart-rending. Well, sir, I suppose I have a right to sneeze when I choose. Quite so, Father. I was merely expressing sympathy. Oh, damn sympathy. There's a great deal too much of that sort of thing going on nowadays. I quite agree with you, Father. If there was less sympathy in the world, there would be less trouble in the world, wouldn't there? Tell me something. Do you always understand what you are talking about, sir? Yes, Father. If I listen attentively. If you listen attentively, you conceited young puppy, sir. With his growing success as a playwright and as a social figure, a new note was appearing in the personality of Oscar Wilde. One might say rather fancifully, if you like, that the joyous, splendid pagan noonday of sunflower and lily were making way for the more elaborate, artificial, vaporous afternoon of the green carnation. One of his poems, written indeed before he had invented what he called himself that magnificent flower, expresses, however, one of the most characteristic of all its moods. We caught the tread of dancing feet, we loitered down the moonlit street and stopped beneath the harlot's house. Inside, above the din and fray, we heard the loud musicians play the Teures Liebes Herz of Strauss. Like strange mechanical grotesques making fantastic arabesques, the shadows raced across the blind. We watched the ghostly dancers spin to sound of horn and violin, like black leaves wheeling in the wind. Sometimes a clockwork puppet pressed a phantom lover to her breast. Sometimes they seemed to try to sing. Sometimes a horrible marionette came out and smoked its cigarette upon the steps like a live thing. Then, turning to my love, I said, "The dead are dancing with the dead. The dust is whirling with the dust." But she heard the violin and left my side and entered in. Love passed into the house of lust. Then suddenly the tune went false. The dancers wearied of the waltz. The shadows ceased to wheel and whirl. And down the long and silent street, the dawn, with silver-sandaled feet, crept like a frightened girl. The same curious mood found its full expression in his one novel, a work which earned for him the unanimous abuse of the critics. It was considered unwholesome, for one thing. Now, of course, unwholesome was a very favorite adjective of the period. Anything you disapproved of, you said it was unwholesome, sir, and you snorted. If, however, you happened to be the sort of person who did approve of that sort of thing, you said it was strangely exotic, and you breathed through your nose. So you see, people haven't changed at all, really. It's only things like hats and adjectives that change. Anyway, this particular work of art was indeed exotic, unwholesome, strange, and so on, and the thing played old Harry for many a long day with late Victorian susceptibilities. The painter Basil Hallward, at work in his London studio, is putting the last touches to a splendid full-length portrait of a young gentleman who is 20 years of age, who is the possessor of birth, breeding, of immense wealth, of astonishingly good looks, and who bears the name of Dorian Gray. The painter feels a certain romantic admiration for his sitter, and entirely against his own better judgment, he introduces the boy one exquisite day in summer to a devil about town called Lord Henry Wotton. Now, Lord Henry Wotton is simply Mephistopheles in Faust. That's who Lord Henry Wotton is, plain as a pikestaff, and the moment he sets eyes on Dorian Gray, he proceeds to pour into the lad's youthful and so far unspoiled ears his own peculiar philosophy of life. This briefly is that youth and pleasure and beauty, however bitterly fleeting, are the only things in the world worth a damn, and that the best way to enjoy them to the full is by draining every cup that life can offer to the dregs. Dorian, timidly but apparently unhesitatingly, becomes a convert. And when Hallward's portrait of him is finished, and he, standing in front of it for the first time, realizes how amazingly young and how ridiculously handsome he is, he utters a prayer. and he prays that the picture may grow old and bear the burden of his deeds and days, and that he himself may remain forever young. Oscar Wilde once said, "When the gods wish to punish us, they answer our prayers." And this, of course, is what happens to the hero of the novel. His prayer is answered, the miracle happens, the picture begins to change, subtly, horribly. And Dorian Gray, terrified by the alteration that is creeping over the painted canvas, has the thing hidden away in an attic at the top of his house in Grosvenor Square, an attic to which he alone holds the key. And then, largely under the influence of an evil but fascinating book, French, of course, given him by Lord Henry Wotton, of course, Dorian Gray begins to lead a life of the most reprehensible, though on the whole unspecified pleasures. He burns indeed continually with what Walter Pater might have called, though he didn't actually, a soft gem-like flame, passing from pleasure to dubious pleasure, and from one strange colored vice to another. And yet, in spite of the passing of the years and of the really dreadful life that he's leading, Dorian Gray continues to look like a blameless young Narcissus. The same, alas, cannot be said of the picture, which, all alone in its locked-up attic, with an occasional visit from Dorian to see how it's getting along, grows older and more hideous, depraved, lecherous, bloated, sinister, horrifying. Well, 18 baroque years go by in this fashion, and the innocent cause of all the trouble, poor old Basil Hallward, who did paint the fatal picture, is troubled by Dorian's evil reputation and by the persistent rumors in London about his mode of life. So troubled indeed is the good Basil Hallward that one ominous, foggy November night he calls on Dorian Gray in Grosvenor Square, and he asks him point blank, is there any truth at all in these hideous things that people are saying about him everywhere? Dorian is furious with Hallward. He is incensed by what he considers an impertinent cross-examination, even from an old friend. And quite suddenly he says, "Very well, Basil. As you seem so concerned about my life, I think you might as well know everything. Come with me, yes? Come upstairs. I keep a diary of my life from day to day, and it never leaves the room in which it is written. Come with me, Basil. You've chattered long enough tonight about corruption. Well, now you can look on corruption face to face." And he takes up a lamp and guides the bewildered Hallward up the stairs. The two men enter the attic together, and Hallward sees to his astonishment that he is in a barely furnished room, dim with dust and cobwebs, and facing him on the wall is a full-length portrait of a stooping, elderly man with the face of a satyr. Slowly he understands it is the picture of Dorian Gray, which he himself had painted more than 18 years ago. And overcome by horror and bewilderment, he reproaches his friend more bitterly than ever. And Dorian, in a sudden fit of passion and hatred, takes up a knife and, rushing at Hallward, he dug the knife into the great vein that is behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table and stabbing him again and again. There was the horrible sound of someone choking with blood. 3 times the outstretched arm shot up convulsively. He stabbed him twice more. But now the man did not move. He was dead. And yet, had it not been for that red, jagged tear in his neck and the clotted black pool that was slowly widening on the table, one would have said that he was simply asleep. How quickly it had all been done. Dorian Gray felt strangely calm, and walking over to the window, he opened it and stepped out onto the balcony. Oh, the air. The wind had blown the fog away, and the night sky was like a monstrous peacock's tail, starred with myriads of golden eyes. He looked down and saw a policeman going his rounds, flashing the long beam of his lantern on the doors of the silent houses. The crimson spot of a prowling hansom gleamed at the corner and then vanished. A woman in a fluttering shawl was creeping slowly by the railing, staggering as she went. Now and then she would stop and peer back into the darkness. Once She began to sing in a hoarse voice. The policeman strolled over and said something to her. She stumbled away laughing. A bitter blast of wind swept across the square. The gas lamps flickered and became blue, and the leafless trees shook their black iron branches to and fro. He shivered and went back, closing the window behind him. The dead thing was still seated in the chair, half sprawling over the table. Basil Hallward. He was nothing now but a dreadful wax image. His eye fell on the picture. Oh, what was that crimson dew that spotted the right hand? Blood oozing from the painted canvas. He turned away and leaned his forehead against the cold, mist-stained glass of the window pane. Then, for some reason, he pulled out his watch. It was 20 minutes to 2, and Dorian Gray began to think. To think. Well, Dorian Gray, with the aid of a scientific friend whom he blackmails to do the work, disposes by fire of the body of the murdered man, and then, in safety, he continues to lead his evil life. But slowly he wearies of it. Slowly the image of decay and corruption at work in his own soul rises like a phantom and confronts him. And then, suddenly one day, his imagination is purified by a new thought, a very simple thought, a form of resolution, a dream for the future. And filled with new hopes, he finds himself one lovely night in summer, about 6 months after the murder of Basil Hallward, dining alone with his old friend, Lord Henry Wotton. And to his host, he confides his new decision about his life. But Lord Henry is not profoundly impressed. There is no use your telling me that you're going to be good, my dear Dorian. You're quite perfect. Pray don't change. No, Harry, no. I've done too many evil things in my life, and I'm not going to do any more. No. If you're going to laugh about it, please let's talk about something else. No, please. Tell me something about yourself. What's going on in town? I haven't been to the club for days. The club? Oh, I don't know. People are still discussing poor Basil's disappearance. Basil Hallward? Really? I should have thought they might have grown tired of that by this time. My dear Dorian, they've only been talking about it for 6 weeks. And the British public are really not equal to the mental strain of having more than one topic every 3 months. They have been very fortunate lately, however. They've had my divorce case, and now they have the mysterious disappearance of an artist. You see, Dorian, Scotland Yard still insists that the man in the grey ulster who left for Paris by the midnight train on the 9th of November was Basil. And the French police declare that Basil never arrived in Paris at all. I suppose in about 2 weeks' time we may be told that he's been seen in San Francisco. It's an odd thing, but everybody who disappears nowadays is said to be seen sooner or later in San Francisco. It must be the most delightful city and possess all the attractions of the next world. Let us have our coffee in the music room, Dorian. You must play Chopin to me. I adore Chopin. The man with whom my wife ran away played Chopin exquisitely. Dorian said nothing, but rose from the table, and passing into the next room, he sat down to the piano. After the coffee had been brought in, he stopped playing, and looking at Lord Henry, he said suddenly, "Harry, did it ever occur to you that Basil Hallward might have been murdered?" Basil? Basil had no enemies, though I will admit he was thoroughly disliked by all his friends. Now, he was really rather popular, and always wore a Waterbury watch. Who on earth would have wanted to murder him? What would you say, Harry, if I told you that I had murdered Basil Hallward? You? I would say, my dear fellow, that you are posing for a character that doesn't suit you. It is not in you, Dorian, to commit a crime. I'm frightfully sorry if I wound your vanity by saying so, but I assure you it's true. All crime is vulgar, just as all vulgarity is crime. Of course, I know that anything becomes a pleasure if one does it once too often. But murder, I should fancy, is invariably rather a mistake. One should never do anything that one cannot talk about after dinner. No, let's pass from poor Basil. I wish I could believe that he had come to such a really romantic end as you suggest, but I'm afraid I can't. I dare say he fell into the Seine off an omnibus, and the conductor hushed up the scandal. Yes, I should fancy that was his end. I can see him now, floating in those dull olive-green waters with weeds catching in his hair, poor old Basil. But if he is dead, I don't want to think about him. Death terrifies me. I hate it. Death and vulgarity are the only two facts that the 19th century has not yet explained away. Why are you so serious? Play me something. Play me a nocturne by Chopin, Dorian, and as you play, tell me in a low voice how you have kept your youth. Don't look so frightened, my dear boy. Obviously, you must have some secret. You really are very wonderful, Dorian. You've never looked more charming than you do tonight. You look exactly as you looked on the first day I ever met you, nearly 20 years ago. Quite incredible. I wish you'd tell me your secret. To get back my youth, I'd do anything in the world except get up early, take exercise, or be respectable. You see, I have sorrows, Dorian, of my own that even you know nothing of. The tragedy of old age is not that one is old, but that one is young. I am amazed sometimes at my own sincerity. Ah, Dorian, how happy you are. What an exquisite life you have had. You've known everything. You've drunk deeply of everything, and yet life has not changed you. You are still the same, and I am not the same, Harry. I've changed. I've changed, and I'm going to change more than ever. You can never change to me, Dorian. You and I will always be friends. Yes, I suppose we will. And yet you poisoned me with a book once. I shouldn't forgive that. Harry, promise me that you'll never give that book to anyone else. Promise me it. It does harm. My dear boy, you actually are beginning to moralize. Soon, you know, you'll be going about warning people against all those sins of which you happen to have grown tired. You are much too charming to do that. As for being poisoned by a book, there is no such thing. Art has no influence upon action. Art annihilates the desire to act. It is superbly sterile. The books the world calls immoral are books that show to the world its own shame. That is all. I'm going already. But why? Then come round tomorrow, will you? I'm going to ride at 11. The park is quite lovely now. I don't think there have been such lilacs since the year I met you. Good night, Dorian. Good night, Harry. But as Dorian Gray got to the door, he hesitated for a moment, as though there was something he must say to his friend, and then he sighed and went out, and it was a lovely summer's night, and as he strolled home, he began to think again about his new resolution, to wonder if he succeeded in making his life pure and whole again, would he ever be able to banish that look of evil and horror from the painted face in the attic? He paused. Perhaps with the very birth of his resolution, with the new life that he had begun to lead, yes, perhaps the signs of evil were already fading from the canvas. Perhaps the picture was beginning to change once more. He would go and see. So when he arrived at his house, he sent his servant to bed, and taking a lamp, he crept softly upstairs. He passed quickly into the attic, locking the door behind him, as was his custom, and placing the lamp on the table, he looked at the picture. No change. No change at all, save that in the eyes there was a new look of cunning, was it? Cunning. And on the heavy, sensual mouth was now the curved wrinkle of the hypocrite. So Lord Henry had been right. The thing was still loathsome, more loathsome if possible than before, and that scarlet dew that spotted the hand seemed brighter still, more like blood newly spilt, and there was blood, too, on the painted features, though the thing had dripped. Blood now upon the hand that had not held the knife. What did it all mean? Did it mean that he was meant to confess to the murder of Basil Hallward and give himself up and be put to death? The idea was grotesque. Why should he confess? There was no evidence against him. No evidence against Dorian Gray. Except that, of course. The picture itself with its evil, leering face and its blood-dripping hands, that was the evidence against him. He would destroy it. He looked round and saw the knife that had stabbed Basil Hallward. As it had killed the painter, so it would kill the painter's work, and all that meant. It would kill this conscience of his, and when that was dead, he would be free. It would kill this monstrous soul life, and without its hideous warnings, he would be at peace. He seized the knife and stabbed the picture with it. And there was a great cry heard, so horrible in its agony that the frightened servants woke and crept out of their rooms, talking in low whispers to each other. After a little, 3 of the men servants mounted the red staircase. They knocked, but there was no reply. They called aloud. Everything was still. Finally, after vainly trying to force the door, the men climbed onto the roof and dropped down onto the balcony. The windows yielded easily. Their bolts were old. But when they entered the room, they found, hanging upon the wall, a splendid portrait of their young master as they had last seen him on that very day, in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not till they had examined the rings that they recognized who it was. For the author of The Decay of Lying, an essay in which Wilde sets forth the theory that far from art's holding the mirror up to nature, it is really nature, and indeed life, who, in their own clumsy, old-fashioned way, do their best to follow art. For the author of such a theory, I say, it must have been an astonishing experience to meet for the first time, and well over a year after the publication of Dorian Gray, with Dorian Gray. His name, of course, was not Dorian Gray. His name was Lord Alfred Douglas, known to his family and his friends as Bosie, and he bore the most amazing resemblance to the hero of Wilde's novel. But unlike Dorian, who never did anything in his strange and terrible life except simply to be Dorian, Lord Alfred was a poet, and a considerable poet. Curiously enough, and as I think significantly enough, Oscar Wilde, soon after the famous and fatal friendship had begun, himself ceased almost entirely to write poetry. His whole attention was focused now upon the stage, and as I believe for the first time on life. And the stage and life to Oscar Wilde meant, of course, the spirit of comedy. Perhaps, as he said himself, he was putting his genius into his life and only his talent into his work. And his genius expressed itself for the most part in his immortal conversation. His talent, it may be, in his plays and in his poetry. We Irish are too poetic to be really great poets, he had explained one day to a very young man called Yeats. Quite the wrong person to say it to. We are a nation of brilliant failures, Wilde went on, but we are the greatest talkers since the Greeks. His own talk, like his plays, like his life, was now all on the plane of high comedy. Only one work indeed appeared during these years that was not dictated by the spirit of laughter, and that was the biblical tragedy of Salome, which gave him world fame and which indeed, as you all know, made his name a household word wherever the English language is not spoken. True, he did not follow the Bible story, as you might say, step by step. Indeed, he elaborated its brief and terrible outline with the fanciful notion that Salome, daughter of Herodias, princess of Judea, demanded the head of the prophet Yochanan, or John the Baptist, as a reward for her dancing because she was enamored of the holy man and because the holy man rejected her. Now this invention, of course it's nothing more than an invention, has nevertheless proved so popular in the world for nearly 70 years that today, in such undisputed centers of scriptural interpretation as Hollywood, Salome's passion for John the Baptist is accepted as being, in every sense of the word, a gospel fact. In this strange play that seems to have been made out of moonlight and jewels and blood, the daughter of Herodias dances for Herod and then makes her demand. Herod, Tetrarch of Galilee is filled with terror by what he hears, and to the princess, in place of the head of the prophet, he offers first a great emerald bestowed on him by Caesar, then his 100 milk-white peacocks, and finally all the jewels of his treasure house. And as Oscar Wilde, one of the few Irishmen, though not the only one to have written a play in French, composed Salome in that language, I would like to describe to you Herod's offering of jewels in its original form. The Jewish princess, having danced by moonlight, makes her request. Donnez-moi la tête, Yochanan. Non. Non, non, vous ne voulez pas cela. Vous me dites cela seulement pour me faire de la peine, parce que je vous ai regardé pendant toute la soirée. Bien oui, oui, c'est vrai. Je vous ai regardé pendant toute la soirée. Votre beauté m'a troublé. Votre beauté m'a terriblement troublé. Je vous ai trop regardé, je le sais. Mais je ne le ferai plus. Oui, il ne faut regarder ni les choses, ni les personnes. Il ne faut regarder que dans les miroirs. Car les miroirs ne nous montrent que des masques. Du vin, j'ai soif. Salome. Écoutez. J'ai des bijoux cachés ici que même votre mère n'a jamais vu, des bijoux tout à fait extraordinaires. J'ai un collier de perles à 4 ans, on dirait des lunes enchaînées de rayons d'argent. On dirait 50 lunes captives dans un filet d'or. Une reine l'a portée sur l'ivoire de ses seins. Et toi, quand tu le porteras, tu seras aussi belle qu'une reine. J'ai des améthystes de 2 espèces, une qui est noire comme le vin, l'autre qui est rouge comme du vin qu'on a coloré avec de l'eau. Puis j'ai des saphirs, Salome, des saphirs grands comme des œufs et bleus comme des fleurs bleues. Et la mer erre dedans, et la lune vient jamais troubler le bleu de ses flots. J'ai des chrysolites et des béryls, j'ai des chrysophrases et des rubis, j'ai des sardonyx et des hyacinthes et des chalcédoines, et je les donnerai tous, mais tous. Et j'ajouterai d'autres choses. Le roi des Indes vient justement de m'envoyer 4 éventails faits de plumes de perroquet, le roi de Numidie une robe faite de plumes d'autruche. Puis j'ai un cristal qui n'est pas permis aux femmes de voir et que même les jeunes hommes ne doivent regarder qu'après avoir été flagellés de verge. Enfin, que veux-tu, Salomé? Dis-moi ce que tu désires, et je te le donnerai, je le promets. Je te donnerai tout ce que tu demanderas, sauf une chose. Je te donnerai tout ce que je possède, sauf une vie. Je te donnerai le manteau du grand prêtre. Je te donnerai le voile du sanctuaire. Donne-moi la tête, Yochanan. Qu'on lui donne ce qu'elle demande. C'est bien la fille de sa mère. On the 12th of February, 1895, Oscar Wilde sent a telegram to one of the most dear and devoted of all his friends, to Mrs. Ada Leverson, the novelist, whom he always called the Sphinx. And here is the telegram: Dear Sphinx, can you come tonight to the theatre, 7:45, dress rehearsal without scenery. Bring Robbie or somebody with you. Have secured small box for you for first night. Love, Oscar. Now, the first night in question was to be the first night of that new comedy about which he felt so certain that on being asked by a newspaper man did he think it was going to be a success, he had answered, but it is already a most enormous success. What remains to be seen, he added, is will the audience be? Of course, by this time, the importance of being Oscar had come to mean the importance of not being Earnest, and we all, I think, remember that in it a young and serious and very cultivated gentleman, respected in the county of Hertfordshire as Mr. John Worthing, and for subtle reasons of his own, known to his London friends as Mr. Ernest Worthing, is in love with the Honourable Gwendolen Fairfax, to whom he offers honourable marriage. Well, he is caught red-handed in the act of proposal by Gwendolen's mother, Lady Bracknell. Gwendolen, with that elaborate girlish simplicity for which she is so justly famous and feared, explains to her mother, "But I am engaged to be married to Mr. Worthing, Mamma," she says. Lady Bracknell is not amused by this, and to her daughter Gwendolen she replies, "Pardon me, you are not engaged to anyone. When you do become engaged to someone, I, or your father, should his health permit him, will inform you of the fact. An engagement should come on a young girl as a surprise. Pleasant or unpleasant as the case may be, it is hardly a matter she can be allowed to arrange for herself. And now I have a few questions to put to you, Mr. Worthing. While I am making these inquiries, you, Gwendolen, will wait for me below in the carriage. The carriage, Gwendolen. Gwendolen, the carriage. You may take a seat, Mr. Worthing. Thank you, Lady Bracknell. I prefer standing. I feel bound to tell you that you are not down on my list of eligible young men, though I have the same list as the dear Duchess of Bolton has. We work together, in fact. However, I am quite ready to enter your name, should your answers be what a really affectionate mother requires. Do you smoke? Well, yes, I must admit I smoke. I am glad to hear it. A man should always have an occupation of some kind. There are far too many idle men in London as it is. How old are you? 29. A very good age to be married at. I have always been of opinion, Mr. Worthing, that a man who desires to get married should know either everything or nothing. Which do you know? I know nothing, Lady Bracknell. I am pleased to hear it. I do not myself approve of anything that tampers with natural ignorance. Ignorance is like a delicate exotic fruit. Touch it and the bloom is gone. The whole theory of modern education is radically unsound, fortunately. In England, at any rate, education produces no effect whatsoever. If it did, it would prove a serious danger to the upper classes and probably lead to acts of violence in Grosvenor Square. What is your income? Between 7,000 and 8,000 a year. In land or in investments? In investments chiefly, but I have a country house with some land, of course, attached to it. A country house? How many bedrooms? Oh, well, that point can always be cleared up afterwards. You have a townhouse, too, I hope. A girl with a simple, unspoiled nature like Gwendolen can hardly be expected to reside in the country. Well, I own a house in Belgrave Square. What number in Belgrave Square? 149. Ah, the unfashionable side. I thought there was something. However, that could easily be altered. Do you mean the fashion or the side? Both, if necessary, I presume. And now to minor matters. Are your parents living? I have lost both my parents, both. To lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks to me like carelessness. Who was your father? He was evidently a man of some wealth. Was he born in what the radical papers call the purple of commerce, or did he rise from the ranks of the aristocracy? I'm afraid I really don't know. The fact is, Lady Bracknell, I said I had lost my parents. It would be nearer the truth to say that my parents seem to have lost me. I don't actually know who I am by birth. I was found. Found? The late Mr. Thomas Cardew, an old gentleman of very charitable and kindly disposition, found me, and he gave me the name of Worthing because he happened to have a first-class ticket for Worthing in his pocket at the time. Worthing is a place in Sussex. It's a seaside resort. Where did the charitable gentleman who had a first-class ticket for this seaside resort find you? In a handbag. A handbag? Yes, Lady Bracknell, I was in a handbag. A somewhat large black leather handbag with handles to it. An ordinary handbag, in fact. In what locality did this Mr. James or Thomas Cardew come across this ordinary handbag? In the cloakroom at Victoria Station. The Brighton line. The line is immaterial. Mr. Worthing, I confess I feel somewhat bewildered by what you have just told me. To be born, or at any rate bred, in a handbag, whether it had handles or not, seems to me to display a contempt for the ordinary decencies of family life that remains one of the worst excesses of the French Revolution. And I presume you know what that unfortunate movement led to. As to the particular locality in which the handbag was found, well, you can hardly imagine for a moment that I or Lord Bracknell would dream of allowing our only daughter, a girl brought up with the utmost care, to marry into a cloakroom and form an alliance with a parcel. Good morning, Mr. Worthing. The first night of the importance of being earnest, the last first night, as Mrs. Leverson, the Sphinx, has called it, was on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, 1895, at St. James's Theatre in London, and it was, of course, a triumphant success. The author was now at the zenith of a fantastic career. Aesthete, poet, scholar, sage, philosopher, critic, dramatist, essayist, wit, a happy husband, the father of 2 boys. Life was very full and rich. Life was exquisite and absurd. And in St. James's Theatre that night, the air was golden with success. It was warm and radiant and scented, although outside the London night was very cold and very dark. And outside the theatre, too, the Marquis of Queensberry, who for a long time now had been protesting vainly and violently against the friendship of his son Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, with the famous dramatist, turned furiously away to drive home through the bitter night. He had been prevented by the police from entering the auditorium, and so he had left at the stage door a bouquet composed, presumably by himself, not of flowers, but of carrots, onions, turnips, and other useful pot herbs. And this bouquet he had intended to hurl with suitable epithets at the head of the famous author. Having failed to do this, the Marquis, the screaming scarlet Marquis, as Wilde used to call him, left a few days later an open card at the Albemarle Club in Piccadilly, of which Oscar Wilde was a member. And when, again a few days later, Wilde himself called at the club and read what the Marquis had written on this open card, he sent a brief letter, not to Lord Alfred Douglas, but to another friend, to the most devoted, loyal, and courageous, it may be, of all his friends, to a man called Robert Ross. My dearest Robbie, since I saw you, something has happened. Bosie's father has left an open card at my club with hideous words on it. I don't see anything now but a criminal prosecution. My whole life seems ruined by this man. The Tower of Ivory is assailed by the foul thing. On the sand is my life spilt. Robbie, I don't know what to do. If you can come here at 11:30, please do so tonight. I mar your life by trespassing on your love and kindness. I have asked Bosie to come here tomorrow. Yours ever, Oscar.